We're going to start our second panel. This was entitled East Asia, Expanding Ties and the Ramifications of the Middle East. Our panelists include Dr. Amane Kobayashi, Senior Researcher with the Institute of Energy and Economics in Japan. Professor Madhuri Daraj from the Political Science Department at TCU, also my former professor and a good friend. And then joining us from the Wilson Center, Senior Associate Kayla Orta. And our discussant will be Professor Takeuchi, Hiroki Takeuchi, who is another co-conspirator for this conference with me. And he teaches political science here at SMU. So, Hiroki.
Right. Thank you for your introduction, Mr. Wahidi. You have a bio of the speakers, so I will not introduce them formally, but more personally. So first speaker is Manshur Doraji, our colleague at the TCU, the other side of DFW, and teaching at the Middle Eastern politics for a long time, I know, but recently it seems that you are interested in China for some reason, and then so he's talking about Middle East-China relations. So Professor Doraji.
Let me begin by thanking the conference organizers. Those of us who've done symposiums and conferences, we know how much time and effort goes into them. And I would be remiss if I don't recognize the three individuals that were not so invisible and behind this audience that we're having together to exchange ideas. And Ray Rafidi, Galvin, Astrid Galvin, and Hiroki, my friend over here, did the heavy lifting to make all of this possible. So thank you, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel. My interest in China began, my first article was published in 2008. Back then, I was very interested as a person who does international affairs in global trends and the type of larger picture transition may be happening in the world. And when I looked at my crystal ball, I said, China is going to be increasingly a very significant player. I better brush up all the things that I've learned in graduate school rapidly and start reading as a humble student to learn as much as I can. And my first article was published on China-Iran relation actually in 2008. And it's an interest that has expanded and extended since. And I have been trying to still scratch the surface. Let me go back. Our guest speaker, who was our keynote speaker, Dr. Tanaka, introduced the idea of West Asia to our consciousness this morning. I want to expand a little more. My first slide is titled "The Return of Middle East to its Asian Home." What we are talking about today is a part of a larger picture that is not only in the United States. Obama used to talk about pivot to Asia, but there's also pivot to Asia globally. But the region that we call Middle East has been pivoting in earnest in the last 30 years or so. Let me just take a minute and introduce the idea to you. Those of you who are soccer fans, if you follow soccer, you would know that some of the countries that we call Middle East, they play in Asian Cup. Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, etc., right? With Japan, with North and South Korea, with China. And then we have part of the region which is in North Africa. They play in African Cup. And then wannabe European nation, which has a small territory in European continent, which is Turkey, they play in European leagues. So this is a region that is in 3 continents, but the main bulk of it is in West Asia. Thus, the justification for use of the term, because Middle East is a British term. They refer to the part of the world that was closest to them, Middle or Near East, the part that was further away from them, Far East. So with that clarification, let me continue. I'm gonna try to speak as fast as an auctioneer. I learned my English in Philadelphia, not in Texas. I get complaint from my students all the time, he speaks too fast. So in order to cover as much territory as I can in the 15 minutes that I've been allotted here for this presentation, I'm gonna try to cover three categories. One is the energy ties, second is trade and investment ties, and the third one is political and security ties. And I'm gonna skip over some of the countries. I have many slides here. I'm gonna skip over many of them so I can fit them all in the 15 minutes time period that I have. Or if you look at the flow of Middle Eastern oil, you will see that the lion's share of Middle Eastern oil goes to Asia these days. It used not to be like this about 20 or 30 years ago. Lion's share of it went to Europe. But these days, the equation has changed, and we're gonna see the significance of this in a moment. If we look at this graph, we are going to see that the region, which is Asia Pacific, dominates in terms of consumption of Middle Eastern oil. And they're projected to dominate. The blue line that you see signifies that by the year 2040. And many forecasters, someone talked about energy transition, argue that oil and gas, particularly natural gas, which is supposed to be a transitional form of energy, is going to be with us until 2050. So the demand for it will continue despite all the hype about solar and wind that we witnessed. The Saudi Arabian oil, the lion's share of it, China is number one, Japan is number two, South Korea, India, Taiwan, and then other Asian nations. It goes there. One of the things that we always pay attention to when we think about energy security, we think of security of supplies, right? But we seldom look at the other side of the equation, security of demand. And one of the reasons China is so attractive for many oil producing nations is that it guarantees that security of demand. It signs long-term contract, it puts side deals on the table, pays prime cash. That means oil and gas that you have is guaranteed to our customers in decades to come. That is why so many of these nations eagerly want to export to Asian countries. And again, in 2022, we see the same thing, that Saudi oil still flows to China, and China is number one destination for it. Iraqi oil, again, China is number one source and destination, India being number two. Again, same graph that demonstrates the significance of China as a market for Iraq. Kuwaiti oil, Kuwait is an interesting case. It does sell a good amount of oil, not just to China, but also to its neighbors, but China and India are primary customers for Kuwaiti oil as well. UAE, Japan is number one, China number two, India number three, Thailand number four. Other Asian Pacific countries receive 21% of its oil. Iran oil, China by far dominates, and that has to do with sanction. Sorry, I don't know why there's a sanction that exists on Iranian oil. And this shows you exactly what countries import what portion of Iranian oil. China is one, South Korea two, India three, and number of destinations. A lot of Iranian oil is smuggled to Malaysia, and this is unknown. I know it's Malaysia. And through pipelines, then it's shipped to China. And then Japan and then Turkey are the major destination for sanctioned Iranian oil, I should say. They try to bust the sanction, as the saying goes. And China's energy imports, again, by the region, we see that region of Middle East dominates. 53 to 56% of China's oil imports comes from West Asia and North Africa regions. China has become Iran's #1 trade partner since 2007. And the impact of Trump administration getting out of the nuclear agreement in 2015 and imposing 1,500 new sanctions on Iranian economy was that Iran was pushed further into the arms of China. And as Dr. Tanaka talked about, by 2020, we had declaration, when for 2025 more formally, that Iran and China have signed a 25-year contract worth $400 billion. I should say much of it has not materialized as of yet, okay? That has to do again with sanctions. That is why the new Iranian administration, what a lousy timing on his part, Pezeshkian, a reformist, once and ran on the platform, I'm gonna try, and I don't care if Kamala Harris or Trump win the election, I'm gonna try to reach out to the United States, go to direct negotiation. We want to lift as many of these sanctions to relieve economic pressure on the people as much as we possibly can do that. But by 2023, the value of bilateral trade was only 14.6 billion. There's a lot of fanfare, a lot of hype, but really sanctions have crippled that possibility. And China has options and possibilities of dealing with nations who are not that troublesome. China has to work through the red lines of sanction, dealing with Iran economically. This is something they don't have to do with Iraq, for example. Iraq, very impressively, Iran, remember 14.6 billion? Iraq bilateral trade in 2023 with China was 49.7 billion. And 30% of Iraqi oil was shipped to China in 2021. And in the same year, electricity minister said China is our primary option as a strategic partner in the long run. Kuwait, there's an attempt to provide a synergy between Kuwait strategy of diversification of its economy 2035 and China's Belt and Road Initiative. We know the same thing exists in regard to Saudi Arabia. But that's also a relationship that we have seen robust growth. Bilateral trade was worth in 2021 about $16 billion. Qatar is the largest exporter of liquefied natural gas to China. One thing that Qatar did, it did not get much attention, but it was initiated in 2015, and we see a lot more of it now, was to create a new clearing bank that would process the exchange of Kuwait, of Qatari energy to China, and then bilateral trade with China through Chinese yuan. And this is something now Saudi Arabia is experimenting with, and Iran has been doing that for a long time. When we talk about BRICS at the end of my presentation, I'm going to come back to the significance of this. And for Saudi Arabia as well, China has become #1 trade partner. The oil export of Saudi Arabia in 2019 expanded by 47% to China. And Saudi Aramco, and this is something that Saudi Arabia and UAE have over Iran. They have a lot of cash to invest in China. Iran does not. Therefore, Chinese value them in terms of trade partnership, very much so. They have banking ties. I've been to Shanghai. I was floored how many gas stations are run by Saudi Aramco. There are refineries, petrochemical plants, massive investment. And of course, Chinese investment in Saudi Arabia varies from high-tech communication, port facilities, agricultural and industrial sectors, and of course, the lion's share of Saudi export to China are petroleum and petroleum products. And in addition, just this past year, by the way, Saudis are trying to diversify their defense suppliers, and they're buying number of missiles and other equipments from China. But given what United States export in terms of military export through Saudi Arabia, Chinese investment towards. One of the things that Chinese did that is stood out, they built a drone factory. The United States refused to do that, citing political instability in Saudi Arabia and what that factory may fall to what hands. But Chinese didn't care. They thought that was their way and their ticket to Saudi market, and they did that for them. And also, not just Saudis, but other countries like, I'm sorry, not just Chinese, but other countries like South Korea and Russia are sought in terms of building nuclear power plants. And one of the things that is important for us to note, we clearly, when the word nuclear program is coined, we think of military aspect of it, weaponization of it. But if you put yourself in shoes of some of the oil producing nations, if you have nuclear power plant producing your electricity, you have more oil and gas to sell and bring more money to the coffers of the government. Turkey, by the way, just signed a massive deal with Russia to build these nuclear plants, and it's well underway for Turkey to expand, because Turkey is net importer of energy, and at least early on, before it ever weaponizes, it needs nuclear power as a source of energy. It would reduce the amount of imports. The value of bilateral trades between the two countries, Saudi Arabia and China, had reached previously to 70 billion, but last year it declined to 42.86. But just a couple of weeks ago, the two sides declared that they're signing a 50 billion worth of contract to do business with one another. Saudis also have had Chinese build a major railroad between two holy cities, that Makkah and Medina, that Muslims have to go to pilgrim, and they have appreciated that. UAE is number 2 trade partner for China after India, and value of bilateral trade in 2022 was $70 billion, and Chinese are also building several ports. One thing I should say about ports, which is significant, not only its anticipation of Chinese maritime safe road and expansion of trade with all these countries, that they also umbrella in Turkey, you have Chabahar in Iran that both India and Turkey are involved in. I'm sorry, India and China are involved in, and Bandar Abbas in Iran as well, and numerous in North Africa. These are ports and water in Pakistan that not only have a design to handle more volume of trade, but also potentially, should the push comes to shove. Now US Navy protects the shipping lanes that much of China's oil goes through, right? They're free riders when it comes to that. But should push comes to shove and there's a naval showdown between China and the United States down the line, these ports can be used as beachhead for Chinese Navy. It's important to note that. So I'm gonna skip over a lot of this. I have a lot more statistics on trade to show you, forgive me. Turkey, Israel, North Africa. I'm gonna go to a couple of things that I think are essential. If you look at this graph right here, lion's share of Middle Eastern business, energy, trade goes to Asia these days. And the second, if you look at this one, China overtook United States in export to the region in 2028, and World Trade Organization has put this table together. It's not my work. And 2010 imports, Chinese imports to the region overtook United States. And then this shows you the darker greenish line is China's bilateral trade versus a lighter blue is United States, that China has overtaken United States in bilateral trade. And this shows you trajectory to trade with the region that has been profoundly upward in the last few years. Let me just pause on a couple of these things. The value of bilateral trade between Middle East and China increased from 180 billion in 2019 to 259 billion in 2022. In contrast, the bilateral trade between the United States and the region went from 120 billion to 82 billion. It went down. Let me just, I don't have time to talk about Silk and Road, arms trade, and this is important. Much of Chinese arms export goes to its own region of East Asia. The second region of the world, which is larger recipient of Chinese imports, is West Asia and North Africa, light blue. Another thing that I want to end on this is political and security ties. China has had joint exercises with Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and has extended an invitation to other GCC nations, naval exercises, that is, exchange of intelligence, transfer of arms, all of that, and was the largest provider of arms to Iran after Bill Clinton imposed sanctions on China, and now Russia has become the largest one. But China has also built instrumentally soft power, alternative institutions of global economic and political governance. And that's very important. Shanghai Cooperation Organization, several countries in the Middle East have joined it. Others are in the waiting list. Belt and Road Initiative, again, several countries in the Middle East have joined it. And many aspire to do. 120 nations now identify China as their #1 trade partner. In the Middle East and North Africa, we can identify at least 8. Let me also share one more statistic that in terms of our strategic outlook is very important to know. Bilateral trade between 22 Arab nations, forget Israel, Iran, Turkey, and China in 2024 has reached $400 billion. It is projected to go up to 600 billion by 2027. Bilateral trade between the United States and China in the last decade has fluctuated between 525 billion to 750 billion. What this means is that China in future, and most significant leverage that we have with China is our economic and trade ties with China, right? I don't think military confrontation or solar mines in Washington is in the cards, at least not in the near future. So if China has these alternative trade partners, they're increasingly bilateral trade ties are expanding, and all the trends show us the trajectory that's going upward. Means China will have partners that will make its bilateral economic ties with the United States now so indispensable as it has been in the past. And that's a very significant development. China's investment in all the corridors of Belt and Road, there are 6 corridors, declined in 2018 with the exception of one, West Asia and North Africa region. Another thing that is important, and this I was asked to briefly comment about Gaza war and its impact. BRICS nation, Iran, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, most notably, have joined. Turkey, Pakistan, Malaysia, Indonesia have put an application in. 34 nations have expressed an interest to join original members of the BRICS. It's growing, another instrument of China's soft power. And they're talking about developing their own currency and payment system that is going to replace, possibly for the nations that have joined the organization, replace SWIFT payment system that is now dominated by Western powers. And Putin has said that we have to create a military alliance of BRIC nations parallel to that of NATO. Okay, so these are important developments. And the fact that these nations also have put application to join the BRICS, I think is partially linked to our not so popular policy regarding Gaza war in the United States. And China's stand, as Dr. Tanaka talked about it this morning, has enhanced its soft power and political capital. So that's the immediate impact. And because China has not had a history of wars and conflict with the region, unlike the Western nations, which have had, Europeans in particular. It comes with a clean slate and therefore can use its soft power and political capital to do more business. Ultimately, all that, not just me, but all of us have talked about today, is a snapshot of a larger picture, which is a global power transition, which is underway. And I hope in next symposium, we focus on that one. Thank you.
Next speaker is Dr. Amade Kobayashi from Japan, the Japanese Institute of Energy Economics. And he is actually a Libya specialist and also is fluent in Arabic. And also he is an energy specialist. He was served as a diplomat for a few years, and he was in Japanese embassy in Libya, but at that time, Libyan embassy was closed, so he was serving in Tunisia. And I was a little bit surprised that this time we were connected in WhatsApp, and then that number is the country code 216, and then what? Where is it? And it was Tunisia, so he has a Tunisian phone number, and so he's a North Africa specialist and an Arabic area specialist, and then one of the themes of this symposium is beyond energy. So we want to talk about not just energy, and then his title of today's presentation is a deepening cooperation beyond energy security. So, Dr. Kobayashi.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Professor. So, of course, every time when the Middle East specialists gather and start discussions, the first question is where the Middle East is, and of course where the Asia is. That is the another question. And when I was working at the Japanese embassy in Libya, I often talked with Libyan counterpart. In Libyan Foreign Ministry, the Asia Bureau is as you could imagine, the busiest one. The Director General of Asia Department is the busiest position, as it includes, of course, Asia, general Asian countries, and also Turkey, Iran. So, how can I say, the perspective on Asia from North Africa or Libya at least is quite wider and also quite different from other countries, at least Asian countries or even the Middle Eastern countries. So the question where Asia is also depends on from where to see the region. So today I will talk about the Japan-Middle East relations. The subtitle is Beyond Energy Security. But to talk about beyond energy security, I have to talk a bit about the energy security itself and how Japan has been dependent on the Middle Eastern oil and gas. So last year, 2023, was quite important to think about the Japan-Middle Eastern relations, or its past, present, and the future. Because 50 years ago, in 1973, there was, as you might know, the first oil crisis, followed by the following the fourth Arab-Israeli war, or so-called Yom Kippur War or October War. And that oil crisis significantly shook Japan's political and economic foundations and shaping its diplomatic relations with the Middle East up to the present day. Japan relies on imports to satisfy most of its oil needs, with approximately 90% of those imports coming from the Middle East. And 50 years on from the first oil crisis, actually the dependence on the Middle Eastern oil has increased, and it is over 95% today, as you could see the slide. So today I will talk about the kind of the historical background of Japan-Middle Eastern relations, and then the current trends, especially under the Abe administration. And then for the final point, I will talk about the trends beyond the traditional energy security or energy trades. So between 1957 or 1958, a Japanese company secured rights to extract oil from Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. Since then, the trade of oil and natural gas has continually been at the heart of Japan-Middle East relations. And after the Great East Japan earthquake in 2011, Japan suspended the operations of most of its nuclear power plants, causing a drop in its energy self-sufficiency rate from around 20% to less than 10%. So Japan is highly dependent on imports for most of its energy resources, not only the fossil fuels, oil and natural gas, but also coal as well. And while there has been progress in increasing power generation from renewable energy sources, partially restarting nuclear power plants and implementing energy conservation measures, securing a stable supply of energy remains a substantial challenge for Japan. And also, oil constitutes about 40% of Japan's total primary energy consumption. About 99% of its crude oil is imported, and predominantly from the Middle East. So after the first oil crisis, Japan endeavored to diversify the sources of its oil imports, reducing its dependence on the Middle East to around 70% in 1980s. But however, due to the various reasons, partially because of the economic development of Asian countries like China or Indonesia, Japan lost their, those countries lost their excess oil export capacity, resulting in the resurgence of Japan's oil dependence on the Middle East. And also, aside from the energy, to safeguard Japan's peace and prosperity, the long-standing policy of the Japanese government has emphasized fostering peace and stability in the region, and to maintenance of the relations with the regional countries. And also on the security front, Japan has encountered difficulties in balancing its engagement in the regional countries with its commitment to the Japan-US alliance. including the significant cases like the Gulf War in 1991, and also US led the global war on terror after the September 11, 2001. And also it is important to note the pivotal role of Japan's self-defense forces, SDF, which operate under strict constitutional constraints. The SDF has leveraged its engagement aimed at the stabilization in the Middle East as an opportunity to enhance their operational scope and refine the supporting legal framework. So post-Gulf War mine sweeping operation in the Persian Gulf, this was the one quite a significant case. And also reconstruction operation in post-war Iraq after 2003. And also refueling missions in the Indian Ocean and two special measures acts, which was after the 2001. So beyond those engagements, the SDF has been intensively deployed in the Middle East, focusing on ceasefire monitoring between Israel and Syria in the Golan Heights as part of the UNDOF, United Nations Disengagement Observer Force, and also in Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. With the so-called MFO, multinational force and observers. They have also tackled the piracy of the coast of Somalia and the Gulf of Aden, and it started intelligence gathering operations in the Gulf of Oman and the Northern Arabian Sea in December 2019. And those increased operations or engagement was intensified during the or under the Abe administration. So late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was the first Japanese PM to visit the Middle Eastern countries after Koizumi administration, which was during 2001 to 2006. So at that time, of course, September 11 happened, and also the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq happened. So it is somehow reasonable that the Japanese Prime Minister visited the Middle Eastern countries. But after that, until Prime Minister Abe, no Japanese PM has visited the Middle Eastern countries. And Abe has been to Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, Egypt, Turkey, Israel and Palestine, and Iran as well. The kind of the active engagement stemmed not only from the critical importance of the region for Japan's energy security, but also from the reality that the Japanese citizens and companies became targets or involved in terrorist attacks and armed conflicts due to the destabilization in the region. And Japan's first national security strategy, formulated in December 2013, stated that the stability of the Middle East is directly linked to the stable supply of energy, which is fine and understandable, and therefore Japan's survival and prosperity. In order to ensure the stability of the region, Japan engages in constructing multi-layered cooperative relations with those countries. So this is one reality for Japan. And also this is another reality that Japan should tackle. This map I took from the Japanese Foreign Ministry travel advice for Japanese citizens. And even though you cannot read Japanese language, you can understand what the color means or what the color indicates. And from those regions, unstable regions, Japan has been importing more than 90 or 95% of crude oil to Japan. So Japan's long diplomacy towards the region is how to address those difficult situations. And also it is very important to mention that the Prime Minister Abe tried to act as a mediator in the region. So historically, Japan's engagement, political and security engagement to the region, it was quite limited. But to overcome this challenge, the Abe administration endeavored to increase Japan's presence by strengthening diplomatic relations with the leaders in the region, and also enhancing the economic and industrial cooperation with the countries. And in June 2019, Abe made a diplomatic visit to Iran, the first visit by a Japanese PM in more than 40 years. In return, Iranian president at that time, Hassan Rouhani, visited Japan in December of the same year. These visits were emblematic of Japan's proactive efforts for de-escalation between the US and Iran, and also in intra-regional tensions. Moreover, as I mentioned before, to ensure the safety of its vessels and also its citizens, the Japanese cabinet authorized the deployment of the self-defense forces with the purpose of intelligence gathering in the northern Arabian Sea and around the Gulf of Aden in December 2019. So the time is limited, but let me touch upon the Japan's activity beyond the energy security. Japan's current Middle East policy is not aimed solely or only at securing oil and natural gas, but also exploring the potential for broader cooperation. In July 2023, Prime Minister Kishida visited Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar. And during this visit, in addition to stabilizing the energy procurement, proposals were raised concerning the collaborations aimed at the practical application of decarbonization technology and the production of hydrogen and ammonia with a view of establishing the Middle East as a future global supply of clean energy and critical minerals. Furthermore, Prime Minister Kishida's visit coincided with the exchange of more than 50 memorandums between the Japan and those three countries. Kishida emphasized the evolution of Japan-Middle East relations into a new global partnership, moving beyond the conventional energy relationship of oil-consuming and oil-producing countries. Anchoring this strengthened relationship in economic and technological cooperation for decarbonization is a meaningful diplomatic strategy for Japan, reflecting its strengths and prevailing international energy trends. It can also aid in securing a stable supply of fossil fuels during the transition to decarbonization. So today or yesterday in Japan, September 19, Foreign Minister Kanukawa announced the launch of the negotiation for Japan-UAE Economic Partnership Agreement, EPA, for the expansion of trade and investment. And this is in parallel with FTA negotiation, free trade agreement negotiation between Japan and the GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council. So those are what is happening now, and let me, no, time is limited, so I will stop here. But if the time is remain, I would like to share some long-term challenges for Japan and the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next speaker is Keira Ota. As Dr. Ratesh said in the luncheon speech, he said that in the question, he said South Korea is important. And East Asia doesn't mean just China and Japan. I agree. As I said at the beginning of this symposium, I spent my childhood in Saudi Arabia, and at that time, South Korea had a big presence. At that time, it was a construction company. So I totally agree that South Korea is important, and we found data. And thank you very much for coming. So it's yours.
First off, I have to say thank you so much for having me. I was going to say we've heard about a lot of different countries today, and we're actually going to hear now about a country, as mentioned, we don't often hear about, and I'm very delighted to hear the foresight and to be able to participate and talk a little bit more about Korea, especially since the conversation came up in the lunch. So as mentioned, my name is Kayla Orta. I'm a senior associate for Korea research. And what that means is that I'm a Korea specialist by trade. So I'll say a lot on Korea's relationship with the Middle East today, but I'll talk specifically from South Korea's perspective, as well as what some possibilities and their viewpoints are in this space. My hope for the conversation is to give you guys a bit of a lay of the land, so to speak, on South Korea's political agenda, what they're focused on, what trade agreements, what opportunities exist for collaboration with the region. And then I'll summarize with the maybe less positive news about the security dynamics and what it means for North Korea and the Russia partnership and what we're seeing there and the potential for spillover effects in different regions in the world. So to get started, Korea is a very interesting country. It's a country of rapid growth. It's a country of culture. It's a country of delicious food. But most importantly, it's a country that is punching well above its weight. It is also a country that has a presidential office position that is actually only a one-term president's office, and that's 5 years. So in South Korea, the president doesn't have an opportunity for a redo, so to speak. They get 1 5-year shot, and that's it, which means they often come in campaigning with very strong ideas and goals for the country. So the current president of South Korea, Yoon Suk-yeol, his agenda when he came in and was campaigning was this concept called the global pivotal state. And his idea was trying to bring South Korea into the international arena, onto the international stage, and more than just security dynamics, but also in business and trade and energy development as well. And so that he campaigned on this idea, and he's continued to leverage this throughout his term so far. So he took presidency in 2022. So he was only a couple of years in, and already he has experienced 18 official state visits abroad to over 20 different countries. So oftentimes traveling abroad and visiting many countries officially at the same time. During this time, he has been definitely leveraging the diplomatic and economic engagement simultaneously, often traveling with 50 to 100 businessmen from South Korea. That while they're having presidential engagements or very senior level state engagements, you're also having this economic partnership and MOU signing in the background, which is quite interesting. He often terms himself as South Korea's #1 businessman because he is helping to broker these deals. And this will come into interesting context when we talk a little bit more about what's happening in the region as well. Now, of course, I did mention we'll talk about the security risk and dynamics, thinking a little bit of how Korea thinks of Ukraine and Russia, as well as Israel Hamas. What is the recent growing or burgeoning relationship between North Korea and Russia mean? But once again, I'll save that for the end. And of course, I imagine we'll get into a bit more during Q&A as well. So similar to my colleagues previously, I'll talk a little bit about South Korea's trading partners. The image on the left, and these images are both from South Korea's Ministry for Trade and Industry and Energy, MOTI. And they did depict the current landscape for FTA, so free trade agreements. And so you can see South Korea, even though their largest trading partners are the United States and China, you can see they have free trade agreements spread all across the globe. Now, interestingly, the photo on the right-hand side are FTAs, or comprehensive economic agreements, that are underway. So as mentioned in the keynote this morning, South Korea has brokered and started negotiations with the UAE and GCC, but these haven't come into full force yet. We're expecting them to come in soon, but they're still pending. And so what's interesting is that we're not only just seeing the fact that Korea has a historic relationship with the Middle East, but now they're putting it on paper, so to speak, and they're codifying it and making sure that it has more even lasting power moving forward. A little bit of history, as mentioned, South Korea has had a long legacy in the region, mainly focused on energy imports. Just like Japan, South Korea is a very low resource country, a very poor resource country, and heavily depend on imports for oil and gas. And a lot of their interest in the Middle East focused on that to start. There was opportunities for construction projects at the time when South Korea was coming out of the Korean War, and you had South Korean companies, also known as chaebols, looking for other spaces to grow and develop their industry and their know-how. They looked to countries in the Middle East to be able to do construction projects. And at the time, it was also designed so South Korea was the cheaper labor. Now, as we know, Korea has massively expanded since then, and we know Korea leads in advanced technology and industry, but that wasn't always the case, especially back in the 60s and the early 70s. Now, what's also interesting to note is that as you had the oil boom and Korea's own industry was taking off in the 70s and 80s, that there was quite a bit of interest in the viability of expanding partnerships in the Middle East in particular. But what's interesting for Korea is that they were very careful to remain a non-political trading partner. They did not want to be stuck in the middle. They were working with both Israel. They had relationships with Israel, but they also had relationships with Middle Eastern countries broadly. And they were very concerned if they continued to invest and rely on project development in the region, that if they were to be vocal or to forward in partnerships with Israel, that there was a possibility of Arab boycott for their products and their services. So as we move forward, Korea also, I think we talked a little bit at one point about this, felt the problematic issues that do come from doing business in a more conflicted region. And so they did feel these pains and moments that conflict rose very quickly. We can see that Samsung experienced losses during some of their projects because of conflict in that region, but also when tensions produced. You saw a lot of that trade trade activity going back up. And so there's a bit of a back and forth there, and Korea quickly learned that even though it was a very rich and vibrant region to be in, that there's also some risk tied to it as well. Now, if we fast forward to today, there's a lot of exciting, interesting topics that are happening, especially on the advanced technology and the energy, what's happening with the energy transition. Of course, we have South Korea winning the bid for the nuclear energy export in the UAE, and I'll talk about that next, because we can't talk about Korea's work today in the Middle East without talking about the nuclear energy project. But there's also been opportunities for electric vehicle manufacturing, digital platform development, other forms of low carbon energy engagement, and of course, infrastructure and shipbuilding, because Korea is well known for their shipbuilding technology. So the Baraka nuclear power plant. So this is particularly interesting because South Korea, I think many people don't realize that South Korea is one of the largest nuclear energy developers in the world. South Korea is up there with the United States, with China, with France, the UK as well. And remember, Korea is a very small country. And domestically in South Korea, nuclear energy is estimated to be about 1/3 of their total energy demand they produce domestically. And so they have a lot of history and experience developing nuclear energy plants in their own country. So a couple of presidencies back for South Korea during the Lee-Myung-bak period, there was a curiosity to take South Korea's industry know-how and take it abroad. So in 2009, South Korea won out a bid against other nuclear energy competitors such as, say, France, which are known to have decades of experience. And in many ways, it shocked the world. I think this was something that Korea was very interested in moving toward, but I don't think people realized how far Korea had progressed. And so it really put Korea's nuclear energy program on the map, and it helped launch it from there. And this also, if we think a little bit about how partnerships engage in regions, nuclear energy isn't something that's done over a couple of years, right? It's not, you're not building a highway. Nuclear energy is done over a decade, multiple decades, sometimes even 2, 3, 4 decades of development. And then once the reactor is built, they can have a lifespan of activity for up to 50, 60, or even 70 years, depending on the reactor design. So this partnership not only solidified Korea's role in the Middle East in developing nuclear energy, but it created a relationship with the UAE as well as other countries in the region. I can talk a little bit more about civil nuclear energy, what's happening there. This is definitely my field, but I think I'll just move on so we get through a couple other topics as well. So I mentioned before that the current president of South Korea has really taken an active role in putting Korea on the map. There's a legacy of this in Korea trying to punch above their weight. But in particular, what's been interesting is this pro-business shuttle diplomacy. Now, we normally think of shuttle diplomacy as exchange at the presidential level, which that's what I'm referring to here. And we often think about how South Korea and Japan have engaged more recently in shuttle diplomacy, where we have Kishida coming to Korea, we have Yoon going to Japan. But here what's interesting is we're seeing this type of engagement with Middle Eastern countries as well. So having senior officials coming from the UAE, coming from Saudi Arabia, coming from Qatar, and also the South Korean president going to those countries and those regions. And I mentioned before, having business leaders tag along. So not just 20, 30 people from the business industry, but 100, almost 135 participated from South Korea and Saudi Arabia's investment forum. So not only you're having these presidential diplomatic engagement, but you're seeing these business leader and business engagement happening at the exact same time, often is the case. So while everyone on TV is watching the presidential handshaking, behind the scene MOUs are being signed and deals are being brokered. And this is quite interesting. Some quick examples, particularly for Saudi Arabia, is that there's the NEOM project, and they have said that they'll have about 500 billion in investment to South Korean companies for urban development in this project. Hyundai Rodam also went out an agreement for an MOU for railways and hydrogen-powered trains, which is quite interesting for hydrogen topics later. And then Samsung also winning construction projects, but not just normal construction, but 3D modular construction, which is quite interesting additionally. Some other fun topics in advanced technology is Hyundai Motors deal for combustion engines and electric vehicle production in the region. You also have digital platforms such as South Korea's neighbor winning its first deal in the region to be able to build digital platforms and countries and cities in Saudi Arabia. And then you also have both UAE and Qatar having interest in LNG carrier orders. So I believe between the two of them, it's over, I think it's 21 in total. But for right now, and then there's a lot of interest moving forward. And this is particularly interesting because, as I mentioned, Korea is a low resource country. And so not only are they wanting to pull in LNG and oil, but if they're helping to build the ships to get them there, that also helps make the dynamic even stronger and closer. Now, I think we've talked quite a bit about energy, and there's some fun conversations. We can talk about global transition. We can talk more on what happens post-peak oil. But for Korea's conversation, it's really about the nuclear and the hydrogen right now. This is really where this administration, as well as the Korean congressional body, has focused on. So South Korea, as I mentioned, has been developing its goals for nuclear energy export. But we've also seen that South Korea is one of the first countries in the Indo-Pacific to develop a hydrogen act, really trying to promote through the congressional body to promote the development and research and investment in hydrogen, as well as most recently this year also revising the CCUS Act, so the carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And so really trying to push industry interest, investment, and buy-in in these sectors additionally. Now, I've given you a lot of fun, interesting things to talk about, and we can come back to it. I also forgot to start my timer, so I'm hoping I'm still okay a little bit on time here. But so let's talk about something, unfortunately, which is the elephant in the room, right? Let's talk about North Korea, let's talk about Russia, let's talk a little bit more about the security dynamics. So from South Korea's perspective, as mentioned earlier today, one of their largest security concerns is the North Korea question. So there has been, at this point, actually September this year marks 30 years of attempted diplomacy with North Korea to denuclearize between the United States and South Korea, trying to work North Korea to the table for denuclearization, and unfortunately this is not happening. So if you go back to 2022, North Korea did their own nuclear posture review and used words saying, 5 minutes, used words saying, for example, that North Korea's nuclear weapon program was irreversible. They would not be pulling it back, they will not be changing it. We've also seen a lot of unfortunate conversation between both North Korea and South Korea about reunification. So reworking reunification policy, the argument is that North Korea is no longer pursuing, and we can talk about what that means. But also South Korea coming back and saying that that's not something they want. So there's a lot of heightened rhetoric and tension tension in the region, particularly between the two Koreas. What's most concerning, I think, to Koreans when it comes to their non-political trading partner status in the Middle East is North Korea's recent re-engagement with Russia. And now I think when we think about Russia, we'll automatically think about Ukraine, and that is obviously a concern. But if this partnership continues to grow, we don't know exactly what technology and information is being shared from Russia and North Korea. Are they supporting their missile program? Are they supporting the satellite program, which is really the missile program? And also, we don't know necessarily what's going from North Korea to Russia. We do know it includes arms, it includes ammunition, drones, and missile technology. We are seeing missiles, really drones of North Korean design in Ukraine. And so the question is what happens when those technologies also start slipping into other regions? Does that embolden North Korea to also then provide ammunition or drone or other technologies into the Middle East as well? And we are seeing some evidence of that. Within what we can access in the public space. So if this continues, there's going to be some questions about how far South Korea can stay out of the conversation and where they should, where they feel comfortable engaging and where they feel comfortable limiting. So in particular as well, we've talked a little bit about arms exports. South Korea, in the midst of them also wanting to develop business practices with nuclear energy, they're also really looking to expand their weapons and defense cells, particularly in the Middle East and other countries. We can think of the Poland deal, we can think about UAE and Saudi Arabia. And this also adds to the question of if they're signing these defense cooperative contracts with a business perspective, what are the security implications of that additionally? And so I think I'll end my presentation a bit with that question about where can Korea fall, because as we're kind of seeing this build out and this history of trade, so to speak, without politics, or maybe a little bit more of an economic pragmatism in the region, can that really stand and how much longer? And I guess one of the things that might be helpful to give a perspective here is that South Korea did not stay out of the Ukraine and Russia dynamic. They did come forward with support for Ukraine. They did push back against Russia, but they haven't done that strongly for anything with Israel. They're being very careful with this, but yet we are seeing a lot of engagement in the region in other areas, and they're definitely paying attention to it. So with all of that, I think I'm really appreciative to everyone staying as long and listening, and thank you so much.
Thank you. My role is a discussant, but rather than asking the questions, I'd like to kind of expand the discussion even more. And then I would like to open to the floor for the Q&A. So one thing that I was thinking about while listening to the today's presentations is we all, it seems that we all assume that or take it for given that the United States presence in Middle East has been declining, and I can agree with it. And then Monashow's presentation says very clearly that now China's presence is increasing. At the same time, his presentation only talks about the economy, right? So then today, I see quite a few students of mine from my international relations class, and because I'm teaching that class this time, usually. So they come to this panel today. So nation usually seeks two kinds of interest, security and economy. And it seems that the US was providing both when US had a huge presence in the Middle East. But now US is withdrawing and China is coming in, but China doesn't provide security, but provides economy. So in that sense, it seems the Middle East has to now take care of their own national security by themselves, right? And then I think that Abraham Accord is one of the outcomes because they shouldn't fight with each other. They more should work with each other for their own national security. So I think security and economy, and each one, how those countries work with other countries. I think that there are four issues that all the Middle Eastern countries are interested in to gain by cooperation. One is, of course, sustainable development. And then two, global health. This is particularly important after pandemic, but COVID was not the first disease that they confronted, right? Climate change, of course, and then counterterrorism. So those four issues: sustainable development, global health, climate change, counterterrorism, and that may be a kind of good issues for them to cooperate. And then finally, I wrote with working with Monoshow, the introduction of the symposium in the which is shown in the program. And then I say that the current world is a kind of leaderless international order. And then it is maybe called post-primacy. This is coming from my friend, Professor Satoru Mori of the Keio University in Japan. And then Monoshow said that, well, also it's called the multiplex world. Well, multiplex world is notorious because the last time we had a multipolar world was the early 20th century, and then we experienced 2 world wars. So how to make international relations more cooperative? Well, one thing I thought was so various speakers talk about West Asia, right? So and then West Asia, and then we also have a concept called Indo-Pacific. If you replace the Middle East with, or then the Middle East and North Africa, MENA region, with West Asia, and then combining it with Indo-Pacific, then starting with the United States, and then East Asia, South Asia, West Asia, and then reaching the west end of North Africa, and then crossing Atlantic Ocean, and then we come back to North and South America. So we round all around the world. And then it seems that, well, it's a good thing of the concept goes all around the world, then a good thing is anywhere can be at the center. And then I think this is actually a good concept for the age of either post-primacy or multipolar world or multiplex world. Okay, so you don't have to answer my points, but let's keep it in mind.
Should we want to, is that an option? Should we want to react to your comment?
Well, let's see, I would like to take a question from the floor, very patient audience. So who wants to start the discussion? Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question for Dr. Doraj. I think more or less we all agree that the United States is either declining or it is not what it used to be as far as its power is concerned in the Middle East. How would you explain this decline of American both material power and also soft power? Many people, even in Europe today, argue that the United States lost moral authority in the Middle East and many different parts of the world. One of the reasons, according to John Mearsheimer and Stephen Waltz, because of U.S. Support, unquestioned support for the state of Israel. Do you think this is one of the critical factors, or do you think there are other factors what explains American decline in the region, in the Middle East, in terms of hard power and soft power?
Very good question. Shall we gather?
Yeah.
Or should I answer it first?
You can answer. You
Okay.
answer his question also. Feel
Sure.
free to include
Yeah.
response to my comment.
Is this on?
Yes.
Great question. Joseph Nye, the renowned American political scientist, he wrote a book on soft power. And soft power is regarded as the most resilient and enduring form of power. You don't have to put a gun on somebody's head. Your example of leadership, moral standing, ideals will inspire others to follow your path. And that's the least costly financially, militarily, and all that. So because of some of our position on the global stage, gradually our soft power has been eroded, right? And when you don't have soft power and guns are all that you have, what we now call endless wars, right? Especially in the West Asia, North Africa region, then power has diminishing returns when it's used excessively and unjudiciously, especially in military form. And when that happens, there is another term that political scientists use, and that is diminishing returns of power, right? That the very goal that you were trying to achieve, you sometimes, one of the unintended consequences of that, you achieve the possible opposite of what you intended to do. Power to destroy is very different from power to control. We had a great deal of power to destroy in both Iraq and Afghanistan, but we couldn't determine political outcome at the end of the day. In Afghanistan, certainly when we went in, spending all the blood and treasure, we didn't want Taliban to come back. That's precisely what will happen. In Iraq, the same thing. George W. Bush went in proclaiming that he is going to bring Jeffersonian democracy to Iraq. But that's not what we got. We got a Shia, semi-theocratic government that is based on confessional politics and not a democracy. So this, I think, in what I chronicled briefly and as quickly as an auctioneer as I could, in Rise of China, there's a lesson for the United States. The whole idea of win-win trade ties, non-intervention, respect for sovereignty, at least in rhetoric Chinese use to go enter into these markets. And I briefly talk about not carrying the bag of colonialism, at least in this part of the world, West Asia has helped them. That goes a long way. And the recent surge in membership of BRICS is a manifestation of our latest stand. You mentioned that, I mentioned that Gaza conflict and where we stood, and we lagged behind in providing leadership in that regard. Therefore, our soft power has further eroded, and that opens the door for countries like China. And this is one last point that I want to share on that. In my study of Rise of China, what I've come to conclude is not so much what China intends to do or China does, but it's also the big elephant in the room, what United States does and does not do. That opens the gates for China, opens opportunity for China, opens a vacuum that China steps in to fill. So decline is a relative term, right? Historians have been talking about decline of British Empire since early 20th century. Great Britain is still a powerful nation in Europe. So American decline is also a relative term as compared to immediate aftermath of the Second World War, that we were the only grocery store on the block. Dollar was running supreme. It's under Reagan that our surplus turns into a deficit, and deficit, the last time I checked, is about 43 trillion and increasing about 3 trillion annually. That cannot be sustained. That has to be returned. So all of that, the decline begins with attending to the problems at home, the dysfunction that we have politically, fractured politics, and all the two candidates who are running the best and brightest, most honest, more thoughtful individual that this country of 330 million has to offer to this country and the world? The answer is obviously not. So we mend the house at home. I think we begin to address substantially how do we stop bleeding and how do we stop the decline.
Yeah. Right on.
Thank you, and thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time and for coming to speak at the symposium. My question is, in these expanding relationships that we're seeing between Asia and the Middle East when it comes to the BRI, or even expanding nuclear power plants in Korea, if you were able to offer one single policy suggestion that the United States should be taking, what would that be and why? And that's a question for either one of you, if the whole panel would like to answer that, but I'd like to know policy suggests and that should be implemented so that in the future, the United States can still have potentially a leading role and what that looks like. Thank you.
Since I just spoke, I'll defer to my co-panelists.
I'll take the first swing at it then. It's an interesting question. I think it's a brilliant question to think through. I should say panelists hate the what if, right? So it's like kind of speculating in the future, but it forces us to think a little bit through. So I'll tackle your question about the nuclear energy perspective. And I'll need a little bit of context here. So what's interesting, I talked about South Korea pushing forward this nuclear energy. What we heard also earlier today is that Russia and China have a legacy and a history and ability. The difference between what Korea can do and what the US can do and what Russia and China have done is that Russia and China offer what's termed as full packets. Not only do they come into the country, they build the reactor, they support running the reactor, they train the locals for the reactor, but then they also remove the nuclear waste at the end. So that country doesn't have the big concern of, not in my backyard, I don't want the nuclear waste stored here. The US and South Korea can't offer that and don't offer that yet. So one of the biggest pushes you've even seen in the policy space is the argument that we can be more competitive together. And so the argument would be, it's one of the policy recommendations I would say is that the US should partner with countries such as South Korea and have the ability to put together a competitive packet. That way we can compete with countries because it also allows us to be in the room when decisions are made when it comes to non-proliferation. And we don't want the continuation of proliferation. Now, I will say that a little bit with a smile on my face because right now, US company and South Korean companies are not working well together, and you might have seen it in the news. And right now, President Yoon is actually later this week or even today traveling to the Czech Republic to have conversations about nuclear energy. And we're still seeing a continual lawsuit with Westinghouse and KEPCO. So if we have high government policy recommendation, I could just say that there, but if we don't have the corporate connection and we're not seeing that, and we're still seeing each other as competition, then it makes it very difficult. So my policy recommendation is a bit tongue in cheek, but I think it's a good question and it's at least food for thought.
Thank you. Difficult question, but so I could recommend the engagement, sustainable, and also healthy engagement. Most of you have read the two papers papers of the foreign affairs. One written by the current national security advisor. Yes, exactly, Mr. Sullivan, Jeff Sullivan, and the former national security advisor to the president, Mr. Robert O'Brien, the recent one. I mean, recent piece. I do not mention or about the details, but the Sullivan piece was both focusing or how to say emphasizing on the more focus on Asia Pacific to counter China's rising power. But the paper of the Jake Sullivan was it is said that too optimistic about the current so-called rapprochement in the region in the Middle East. The O'Brien's piece is too harsh to Iran. And how can you say, even though the US is more focused on Asia Pacific is good for Japan security or security environment, improving or maintaining security environment in East Asia. We all know that the administrations, the US administrations have been dragged into the chaos or instability in the Middle East. So healthy engagement or continuous engagement is critical for not only the Middle East, but also entire or global stability or stability of the global security. And also in that case, healthy, sustainable, reasonable cooperation with the allies and the like-minded countries, including, of course, South Korea and Japan in the region, will be quite critical. One more thing is not to see China's rising role in the region as a threat to the US security too much. When we talk with Middle Eastern experts, they don't think that China will or could take the role as the supreme power or supremacy power in the region. And China does not want to fill the gap of vacuum in the region. That is, so if we or the US sees the China's rising presence in the region as a threat or especially a threat to the US national security, it might be misleading and also quite risky. That is what I think.
Anshu? Yeah, I pass.
Oh, okay.
We covered it. Thank you.
Okay, well, I may add that one thing, don't be obsessed with the framework of democracy versus autocracy, because those countries most of those countries are authoritarian countries, and then they want to work with both China and the United States. So, it's, their concern is security and economy, so,
May I just say one thing about security and the economy? One of the problems with the region of West Asia and North Africa is that the whole framework for compromise also almost has a bad connotation. A framework for negotiation, political bargaining, give and take, that nation that is based on trust among nation and all that is either non-existent or is on very shaky legs. It takes for China to come in and mediate between Iran and Saudi Arabia, external powers. Until recently, where the United States was perceived as a neutral broker in Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the two are too consumed, the two sides, in their own bubble in terms of how they see the other as absolute incurable enemy that you cannot compromise with. It took an external mediator to come in and somehow mediate the conflict. So one of the problems is that the whole idea that security is a zero-sum game. I win only if you're smashed and you lose in an increasingly interdependent world has become rather obsolete. Possibility of coexistence, summoning the art of diplomacy rather than shoot first, ask questions later, that needs to take root. And it's not, unfortunately, on very solid foundation in terms of culture and political culture of the part of the world that we're talking about. So for a lot of countries, therefore, economic survival under this condition of lack of trust, lack of a framework that you can trust, etc. Economic survival is the first. I'll worry about my security myself, and with proliferation of knowledge about drones, missiles, etc. that you see spreading throughout the region very rapidly, they're moving towards self-sufficiency in that department, so they don't put their chips in anybody's basket that they cannot trust as an external power. I think we're witnessing that as well.
okay, there's 3 hands over there from, so, okay, let's start with 2 students. So Will and then Brandon.
Thank you, guys. This is a question for Dr. Kobayashi. Kind of with Japan becoming so reliant on Middle Eastern oil, do you think there's any incentive or efforts of Japan to become more independent, maybe rely less on a Middle East that can tend to be unstable?
Okay, let me take questions and then ask panelists to answer. So Brandon?
Hello, Professor Darash. My question is for you. Thank you for taking it. Do you think that Gaddafi's overthrow in Libya and the US support for Mubarak's overthrow in Egypt about 10 years ago, after agreements were made not to intervene, have caused countries like Iran, North Korea, and others to be very weary about negotiating with the United States? And how should the US combat these past decisions, walking back on deals that were formally made?
Jim, you had a hand?
couple of anecdotes for the panel and, I don't know, question, corrective. We've been talking for decades about American decline, and it reminds me of the comment about Mark Twain's death. You remember that? The rumors of my death were much exaggerated. Also, Fermenter and the others have been caught in exchanges between Joe and I and John Mearsheimer a few times, and I remember once turning to John and saying, asking him if he was working on his soft power skills. I thought he was gonna punch me. But let's go back to hard power. I mean, we've had a day discussion here. I don't think the US Navy has been mentioned once. If you think about the sea lanes between Asia and the Middle East, or you think about securing Straits of Hormuz or Malaccan Straits, don't forget about the US Navy. I mean, and, you know, with all the hand-wringing about the US, I mean, it strikes me that, yes, we have to go back and re-engage in the Middle East. It was always crazy that we were going to pivot to Asia and leave the Middle East, but the US is still, I think, sort of the guarantor of some kind of balance of power in Asia, unless I'm missing something here. And the US Navy is still a pretty important part of the equation here. So I'm sorry, Manager, to bring us back to this hard power thing, but let's hear it for the US Navy. Thanks.
Okay, last question. Yeah.
Taylor, I was struck by your comment about the business, I mean, sort of minister traveling with businessmen. Since Korea and Japan are both characterized by very much being driven by their major corporations. And much of this conversation today has been about nation states and their respective military, trade, and financial status. What is your view, since you represent Hyundai and Japan has its own favorites? What is your view about the evolving power of the global corporations driven by your respective countries versus the US global corporations and how they're evolving? Is the US global corporate game fading as equally well as our finances seem to be fading, or are they, where do you see it going? And versus China, which seems to be one large global corporation, versus the sovereign wealth funds in the Far Middle East, quote, Middle East as it used to be defined. What do you think? I mean, what is your view from Hyundai and what is your view from Toyota?
Okay, well, one thing I add to Jim's point of the Navy is actually, so Professor Tanaka's keynote speech that shows that there's Silk Road map, but he only shows the route of the land Silk Road. But actually, more goods were traded at that time by maritime Silk Road. And that is actually also increasingly important, I think. Okay, who wants to go to, let's go to this, the reversal of the
Yes.
presentation. So starting with the,
Yes, also I should have clarified, so the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars is an instrumentality of the US government, so we actually managed to exist by Congress. And even though we have a named institution, and we have funding, we are separate, we're nonpartisan, and we're also independent. So I cannot fully speak for Hyundai, but I can speak from perspectives, and I think it's a good question. So I should have put that out there because the DC talk as usual. So maybe I want to answer this question, but I also want to tag maybe a little bit onto the North Korea Libya question as well. So I'm going to put that out there. So the first question I think is really well put and really well stated when thinking about where is US economy, where is US industry heading globally, where are we looking to allies to fill in gaps, why are there gaps? And a lot of these conversations are happening right now in DC, especially around the topic of what is economic statecraft, what is economic security. And when we do a lot of our work, particularly on Korea and Japan and the trilateral, we find that there's not a consensus on what economic security means between the three countries. They all see it a little bit differently. From the US perspective, when we talk about competition with China and our industry development, it's often specifically advanced technology and critical technology industries, right? We're not talking agriculture, we're not talking transportation, we're not talking urban development, we're talking semiconductors, EVs, AI, that's what we're really talking about. And so when we have this conversation, my first thought is always thinking to myself, which sector, right? So where are we in decline and where are we still leading? The nuclear energy one is a very good example. I know we talked a little bit about it today, but I'll go back to it because unfortunately we are in decline in the nuclear energy sector because we haven't continued to develop the talent pipeline. We haven't continued to develop the companies and technology for construction. We're actually looking to our South Korean partners for building the, not only just the technical components for reactors, but even when you think of the iconic reactor shell, those construction, that large project, we don't have the company capacity to do it very well or very fast. In some ways, we've done it wrong recently, and it's delayed the reactor development even in the US. And so when we think a little bit about, I think we want to talk very large, we talk big corporate, but we also need the smaller corporations and partnerships to be able to develop even just components. And we're lagging behind. It's also true in the space industry. When I talk with colleagues over at Northrop Grumman, they're saying that they don't need a talent pipeline inspired today. They needed a talent pipeline inspired, 10, 15 years ago. They need people coming out of MAs and PhDs and going straight into the job. And they're trying to figure out how do we pull in interest and talent. And then the last point I'll say is when we look toward the future, when we think about new technologies, small modular reactors for nuclear, we think about hydrogen, we think about HALEU, so in thinking about that energy production, we also need investment. Right? Is how do we compete if China is sponsoring not only paying for location and paying for the industry construction and then subsidizing? That gives them a boost immediately in a way that a lot of US corporations are still fighting for early investors and buy-in, and the question about what's going to happen later, if that buy-in is going to be useful or not. One point that will give us a bit of hope is a lot of the conversation I have in DC is that yes, China has the ability to subsidize and do this, but it's an artificial boost. It's a boost in the beginning. It's not necessarily a boost and the idea that the outcome will be beneficial. They can be pouring lots of money into different ideas, and when those flop, it'll be a waste of that money, whereas US competition is happening early in that system. And so maybe that likelihood of it being more productive moving forward. We can kind of debate about that argument. I know I'm also talking a little bit long, but I think it was a very good question. It was a very high level question, so I wanted to respect it and get into the topic. So one thing I'll say really quick about North Korea and how it ties in. I think North Korea they are definitely looking at the global landscape and what's happening. The Libya question is a good one. They do not want to be Libya. They want to be India. They want to be Pakistan. They do not want to be Libya. And we can see this coming through in their policy. So I talked about the 2022 nuclear posture review or their nuclear security law. And they, for the first time, actually put in writing, at least for the public and the foreign engagement, what would happen if US or allies were to attempt a decaffeination attack. So the idea that they put in writing that there would be measures and systems in place that if Kim Jong-un suddenly disappeared, somebody else would hold the nuclear codes because they're concerned that that could happen. They are afraid that we would go in and potentially remove a high-level threat. So now they have ways in writing. And I think this is also added to US concerns about what is the future of North Korea expanded missile and nuclear weapons program. And that's also why we're seeing South Korea talk about their own indigenous nuclear weapons program as well in the past couple of years. And there's a lot of domestic support for that, counter to what US and South Korean alliance want there to be for US perspective in the region. So I will stop, but thank you for both the questions.
Amane?
Thank you. Is the first question about oil only or broader energy?
Whichever you think is more
Okay, thank you. So, of course, Japan has been, especially government has been trying to, lessen or decrease the dependence towards the Middle Eastern oil. But so it was somehow successful, as I mentioned in the presentation. But in 80s or late 80s or 90s, oil became commodity from the strategic assets for Japan. As at that time, the energy situation or international not political economic situation was somehow stable, and the oil price was cheap or cheaper. So Japanese government, especially Ministry of Economy and the Agency of Energy, thought that it was not the timing to prioritize the energy security or diversification of the oil imports. And unlike China or even South Korea, Japan's energy companies, all or most of them are private, not state-owned. So for the government, the leverage was quite limited to control or from where to buy, from where not to buy. That was the situation. And the energy, considering the energy transition, so how can I say, the less dependence on Middle Eastern oil through the energy transition or increasing the renewable energy is fine, but it has risks as well. So for example, the geopolitical risks, so-called energy geopolitics or geopolitical risks of energy or dependence on the Middle Eastern oil for Japan and other Asian countries, including South Korea, is that not unlike the US, we are not how do you say? We are not easily involved in the conflicts in the region. But more important point or risky point is the transition or transportation. So as Professor Tanaka mentioned in the luncheon presentation or keynote speech, there's Hormuz Strait and also Malacca Strait. So the transition, that it is quite a classic geopolitical theory. The transition and choke points are where the risk is. So even we succeed to the energy transition to the hydrogen, for example, or renewables, the risks of transportation or choke points still remains. And also energy transition, so energy transition is fine, but it means that it could mean more dependence on solar panels or battery made in China, or critical minerals, which are important to make produce a battery or other how to say semiconductor as well, and other sources, which are produced or which are processed mainly in China, and sometimes in Africa, especially in conflict countries such as Congo. So the nexus of energy, conflict, and security, those remains, even though we doesn't mean only Japan and South Korea, but the global world or international community could succeed the energy transition. Of course, it could be less greenhouse gases emission, but it could increase that kind of the nexus of the energy geopolitics.
Okay, in interest of time, Gaddafi and Mubarak, we never were in good terms with Gaddafi's government, and after he got rid of his chemical and biological weapon, we left him alone. But as you don't remember what I do, Reagan bombed him in an attempt to get rid of him when he was in the White House, as he was implicated in the WTA passenger bombing that killed many Americans. So we were looking for the opportune time, and when he was on the rope, we said, okay, let's give a green light to our European allies primarily, but much more active in getting rid of him than we were toward the end. Mubarak proved to be a liability when the street demonstration became larger. I recall correctly that our position was that we stand by our erstwhile ally, who is also in good term with Israel, the Mubarak. Both Hillary Clinton and who was at the time the spokesperson of the State Department who mentioned this. And after demonstration got a lot larger, and he proved to be the center point of demonstration, fearing that if Mubarak unleashes forces against demonstrators, radicalization is going to set in, and from that, something like Iranian type of a Muslim Brotherhood takeover in Egypt is going to happen. I vividly remember President Obama comes and said, transition begins now. Means let's get rid of him. He is a liability now. So that's why we gave not to the army to get rid of their figurehead who was Mubarak. Does it cast any doubt on credibility of alliances with the United States? I think a realist political scientist, you mentioned Mearsheimer, is probably in best tradition of a realist, who would say it's your interest and not your sentiment that dominates your politics or your position or policy. Regarding the American decline and the place of hard power, more specific, the U.S. Navy. I'll mention briefly that I regard decline as a relative term. Strength of U.S. dollar may not have been what it was 30, 40 years ago. And then decline as a relative term in the sense that all the countries that were not once a competitor for the United States, mostly East Asian countries, economically begun to recover after the Second World War, and countries like China have come to their own, etc. So compared to preeminence that we enjoyed economically and politically, still militarily, I think we are the most powerful and preeminent nation on the planet. But relatively speaking, economically, we have declined as competitors have caught on. Let me also share with you that according to Goldman Sachs, by 2050, 4 nations, and this is what I'm about to say, further accentuate how significant the topic we are discussing today is. 4 nations are going to dominate the global economy in this order: China, United States, Japan, India, 3 of them Asian countries. Okay, by 2050. And is there a place for hard power in global politics? Of course there is. Of course, you have to be naive if you don't see that, right? Therefore, I think, but the time has come for us to take a second look at the place that military hard power plays in our toolkit of policies. We have been too preoccupied with using, and that's very tempting. We are the most powerful nation militarily in the world. To say that I'm going to put that in my back pocket and use my soft power. Okay, so it is tempting to use that because that provides an immediate remedy, intimidates, destroys, etc. But does it get you the outcome that you want politically? That's the ultimate question. So my take on that is that we need to be a lot more judicious, and it's time for a second look at hard power as a tool of achieving diplomatic or political goals.
Okay, we know that this is a topic that we can continue to talk. We can keep talking about forever for next hours, but we have to finish. So before moving to the closing remarks, please join me for thanking the excellent. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our last speakers, and those who know me know that I'm a huge baseball fan, and here is a baseball analogy. All the good baseball teams have a great closer, and I cannot think of anybody better than Ambassador Bob Jordan for playing the role of being a closer. of this symposium. Ambassador Jordan, just in case those who do not know him, he's a former ambassador to Saudi Arabia, U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia from 2001 to 2003. You know how crucial it was at that time to be U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia. And since then, he has always been engaged in the U.S. Middle East policy. And then every time I talk with him or he comes to my class, I always enjoy his discussion. And the last time he spoke in my class was 1 week after October 7th of 2023. And then he also gave a very a long time perspective, incorporating the short-term issues. Please join me for welcoming Ambassador Walker.
Thank you, Hiroki. I know you all join me in appreciating what we have been through today. I've been to countless symposiums, but I can't tell you another one that has held my attention for the entire day. This has been absolutely fantastic. I think we've all learned something, and it's on us now to carry that forward. Let me just have a few comments. I don't want to stand between the group and cocktail hour. But I think it's important, from my perspective, King Abdullah in Saudi Arabia became king in 2005 after having been crown prince for many years. I worked very closely with him. But when he became king, the first thing he did, the first foreign trip he took was to China. Why would that be? Well, that's because China, of course, became the largest crude oil customer of the Saudis and much of the Middle East. And just think, if you and I were running a hamburger stand and somebody bought 25% of our day after day after day, we would pay attention to them, wouldn't we? We'd send them Christmas cards. We would be absolutely delighted at whatever they want us to do. And so I think we've got to remember that countries act in their own interest. I tell my students, where you stand depends on where you sit. And other countries get to have a national interest. And so what we're trying to do here is to manage that process. Diplomacy is about dealing with other countries that have a national interest. And sometimes the way they perceive their national interest is inconsistent with our objectives. But we try.
We have some microphones.
I'll keep talking and we'll see how far this goes. I was taken by Professor Tanaka's comment this morning that particularly the Chinese are not really driven by values. They're driven by metrics and by cold-blooded analysis, if you will. And even though they are increasing in their soft power, it's all in the service of what they perceive to be their national interests. The common saying in the Middle East has been that, yes, we are interested in China, we're interested in Russia, we're interested in many of these other countries, and we have a lot of common economic interests. But when there's an existential threat to our country, the only country in the world that will come to our rescue is the United States. I think we've heard today and we've seen in the news that that is eroding somewhat. It eroded during the Trump administration when attacks on the Saudi and Emirati oil fields occurred and no action was taken. But it eroded in other ways as well. We heard just a minute ago about the fall of President Mubarak in Egypt. That was greatly resented, certainly by the Gulf states. The invasion of Iraq. The Saudi foreign minister told me we didn't know what we were doing when we invaded Iraq. And then when we did, he said, Mr. Ambassador, you have now turned Iraq over to Iran on a silver platter. and to some degree, he was right. The so-called JCPOA, the nuclear deal with Iran, was a huge irritant to the Gulf Arabs. And so many of these issues keep coming up. The murder of Jamal Khashoggi, who happened to have been a friend of mine, I was very critical of that. And we had a presidential candidate, now President Biden, who said famously that Saudi Arabia would be a pariah nation. He had a hard time walking that back. And when he did his fist bump with the crown prince in Saudi Arabia, people rolled their eyes. So it is a constant challenge for us to deal with, in some ways, our values on the one hand that conflict with our national interests and other countries' national interests on the other. And that is something that I think we've got to deal with as we go on. It is significant, I think, that the Chinese are infiltrating not simply the Middle East, they're infiltrating the United States. There's actually a fascinating book that has just come out called Dancing with the Dragon, written actually by a Dallas resident named Patrick Genevine. And Patrick tells a story of his own personal experience in dealing with China as a partner, but also the infiltration that China has engaged in the United States, buying farmland, agricultural land, buying up natural resources. We've talked today about the ports along the Red Sea that the Chinese may be able to use for bases later on. This is something that is worldwide and something that we have to understand and its vast implications. So for us to say that they're not a threat, I think perhaps it's in the characterization. They may not be a military threat today, but they may very well be a threat to develop Huawei, for example, computer backbones around the world, to develop the soft power that we're hearing about. And I don't want to sound hysterical about it, but I think it's very important for us to recognize that there are palpable threats out there, not just to us, but also to our friends in the Middle East. And so this is something that has to be recognized and dealt with on a clear-eyed basis. Again, understanding what their national interests are and balanced against our own. I think it's fascinating to understand also the dynamics going on in the Middle East with respect to the South Asian, particularly the South Asian workers who make up such a tremendous amount of expat workers in the region. Their remittances to their home countries, to their families, are enormously important. And in some cases, countries like Saudi Arabia that are cutting back on allowances for expat populations who take jobs in their mind away from Saudis who might actually choose to work, is a great danger for the economies of some of the countries where the remittances are sent. And it's also to some degree a danger even to the economies of Saudi Arabia if they can't fill those jobs that they're having replaced by their own workers. I want to close by thanking all of our panelists here for a day that has been really memorable for me and I hope for the audience as well. What expertise, what ability to communicate, what ability to bring our attention to so many of the most critical issues really facing us in the world. And I want to thank the organizers, Professor Takeuchi, Ray Rafiti, everyone who has helped organize this, Astrid, the staff. This is the kind of program that really makes SMU distinguished. Please feel free to come back next time, and we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.